Welcome everyone to part 2 of understanding microorganisms in wine. Actually, today it is called Wine Quality, Climate Change, and Microorganism in Natural Fit. For those of you who were there for part 1, we went through understanding microorganism in wine so that you could follow a little bit easier today about what can be done to mitigate the challenges that winemakers have in the winery with climate change. If you were not there for part 1, do not worry. I think you're going to be able to follow, and then you can watch back online part 1. If you go to tastingclimatechange.com under the off program, you will see the recording of part 1. There's a lot of amazing information there. I am very excited about today. I wrote a book last year called Quel vin pour demain, Which Wine for Tomorrow. I co-wrote with a scientist and a master of wine, Jérémy Courquier-Man, and I was the one in charge of writing the part about microbiology. And I knew about it, but I reached out to Anne Dumont, who's going to be with us today at Lallemand, to discuss, to help me go over what can be done. Because when we talk about climate change, we often talk about the challenges that we have in the vineyards, but we don't talk so much about the challenges that winemakers are facing with a lot of things that are happening. We're having higher pH. We also have challenges like smoke taint, lower acidity. So what are the things that the winemakers can do to adapt to those challenges? So today with me to speak, I have an amazing panel, starting with Barbara Philippe, Master of Wine, all the way from British Columbia. Barbara was the first Western Canadian to achieve the Master of Wine designation in 2007, the first woman. Based in Vancouver, she is the category manager for the BC Liquor Store, one of the largest liquor retailers in Canada. Barbara is responsible for the European selections in the 198 store, as well as sparkling wine, fortified wine from around the world, and also buying the wines for British Columbia. With her husband, Ian Philip, Barbara runs Barbarian Wine Consulting, and she regularly works as a presenter, journalist, and judge. She has trained sommelier in the United States and lectured in Europe and across Canada. In addition, Barbara contributes to various media on a freelance basis, and for 10 years, the wine columnist on CBC One Awards, and for 10 years was the wine columnist on CBC Radio 1 on the coast. Barb is the panel chair for Canada at the Decanter World Wine Awards in London, and this includes the Argentinian Wine Awards, Gambetta Rosso, and the BC Lieutenant Governor Awards as competition in her vast wine judging experience. Sorry for mumbling here. My phone is going to my computer and it's ringing, so I just turned it off. Barb, she was recognized for her work in European wine by some of the world's most prestigious wine organizations, and she is the member of Confrérie des Gentilshommes de Fronsac, the Confrérie de Vins de Porto, the Commanderie des Vins d'Amboise, and the Confrérie des Chevaliers du Tasse de Vin. Also, from South America, we have José Marias HERAS. We call him Pepe. So Pepe is an agriculture engineer. He received the Master in Viticulture and Enology designation from the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, Spain. Having worked during the harvest period in different cellars in Spain and abroad, he became the technical manager of cellar and vineyard in Castilla y León. In 2005, he joined the Lallemand team in Spain and Portugal, and he understood that he's not from South America, but Spain, so I'm sorry. Since 2008, he is the charge of research and development projects in Spain and Portugal, being a member of the Lallemand R&D team. He is currently the global technical director responsible for coordinating the transfer and development in the winemaking process. He provides technical support to winery suppliers and winemakers worldwide. And returning today, he was there at the first part 1. We have DIRCEU, Viviana, Junior Master of Wine. Junior, I hope I pronounce your name correctly. You will be able to say it correctly if I made a mistake. Originally from Brazil, he studied forest engineer in law before he moved to London in '89 and became involved in the wine trade. Since then, he's traveled all over the world. He became a Master of Wine in 2008. After he contributed to the Opus Wine book, he co-wrote a book entitled Conheça Vinhos, meaning Understanding Wine, a wine publication in Portuguese that won the Gourmet World Cookbook Award in Paris. He has contributed to several publications around the world, including Decanter Magazine, Drinks Business, Adega, and the Grandes Escolas. For most of his career, Junior has been the wine director at some of the most important wine distributors in the UK, with 3 decades of experience in diverse sectors of the wine industry and extensive contacts in our consults for business around the world, including Africa, South America, and Europe. He's a judge at international wine competition, a technical director, commercial consultant, and wine educator. And finally, we have Anne Dumont. Anne Dumont actually did an amazing presentation at part 1. I really encourage you to watch it. Anne, thanks for being here because you really are the instigator. She really worked with me to put on this project together. She works at Lallemand. She is the communication manager for Oenology Group at Lallemand, and she has an amazing amount of knowledge. And so Anne is going to be here today to answer questions. What we realized last time is that there's so many questions that we did not get through. So as we go, I really invite you to type your questions in the Q&A box, and then we will answer them throughout the presentation and at the end. But Anne will also be filling in the questions and also participating to the Q&A at the very end of the presentation. You can also follow Tasting Climate Change on tastingclimatechange.com on Instagram. And there's lots of different videos there that you can watch from previous year's presentations. So I encourage you to go if you want to learn more about tasting climate change, the solution we're facing with climate change. So Barbara Philippe, we are going to start with you today. Really thrilled to have you. Barbara will give us an outlook from a Canadian perspective on the impact of climate change on wine quality trends and how they affect the wine business. Barbara, it's all yours.
Thanks, Michelle. And thanks for the opportunity to speak about this from a category manager point of view, because it's something that we don't often hear. And like every sector and like every tier in the supply chain, it comes with its own special set of challenges. Our objective, my objective, is to have a consistent supply of quality wine on the shelves throughout the year. But doing that is a struggle, especially if we're conscious of each producer and the struggles that they have to go through, and also being mindful of the impact of everything that we do on the environment. And something I think, I do work for BC Liquor Stores, as Michelle noted, and we definitely work with large brands. And for them, it's essential to have a wine on the shelf all year long, right? The fear of you losing the listing, et cetera. So how do they manage to do that? Again, being mindful of the impact, being mindful of their effect on climate change, etc. And we also work with small family producers, and they have their own kind of set of struggles because they don't often have the resources, whether it's people or money or whatever it is, to be agile and adapt to the different things that each vintage is throwing at them. And I think that's really the thing that occurs to me, is that both as a buyer and then as a producer, it's about being agile, it's about being creative. And more, it's very interesting to work with people and see that people are adapting and being creative. And I hope that in our discussion today, we're going to learn even more about the possibilities of that. When I manage a category, I think in terms of building the category and doing that through long-term relationships with our suppliers. And I think that that's the only way to really work together to make change, to be conscious as we go forward, to be creative, to be agile, to not worry so much about, I mean, Michelle, you asked me a great question just in text last week saying, oh, well, are you raising your prices or are you trying to keep prices down? And I think at a certain point in this business, especially now with the challenges we have, supply chain and dry goods, et cetera, we have to realize that sometimes if we want to do things properly, they are going to cost a little bit more. I think this is just a fact. I think the days of squeezing people for price and asking producers to cut costs and save on their labor, save on their goods, etc. I think we're really moving away from that, and I think that's really important. And I think that big buyers really have to lead the way in that. For me, in my role, there are three main areas today that I feel these pressures more keenly. And the first one I'll talk about is BC. And I have a beautiful picture of the Okanagan Valley that I'm not able to show you right now. Michelle, oh, here it comes. How lovely. There it is. So our beautiful valley. And for those of you who haven't spent time there, haven't been there, you know, there's this sort of idea that BC, that the Okanagan, because it's really right at the 50th parallel by the time you're in the north of the region, there's this feeling that it's a cool climate. But of course, those of us who have spent summers there know that that's absolutely not true. What's true about this climate, and has always been the case, is that it's extreme. So you have heat in the summertime that can cause many grape varieties to shut down in their ripening, and you have extremely cold temperatures in the winter, resulting in winter kill, in bug kill, etc. And what we have seen, and we've seen it very poignantly in this last vintage, is that with the changes in climate, the Okanagan, the central BC has become even more extreme. So there was a lot of news coverage about it last year, but in fact, in the growing season, it was 50 degrees in some places, 50 degrees, hotter than Las Vegas has ever been in our cool climate. And then in the wintertime, there was winter kill. So minus 26 degrees, etc. And this is the effect on wine quality, the effect on yield. I mean, we see this. I talked at the opening about being able to provide a consistent supply of quality wine. Yields were down 30% in 2021. Also, we're dealing with smoke taint. There were widespread wildfires throughout the growing season. So what are the effects of that? And then, as we know, once things mess up climatically like this, we see insects that have never been problems before. We see leafhoppers that were never in the numbers that they were in 2021. So how do we manage this going forward? And especially in a region like BC, in the Okanagan, where we're just starting to really come on the world stage with our wines, to be sort of cut at the knees with these kind of problems is very scary. So how do we move forward with creativity and mindfulness in that? And I kind of have the enviable position today, as Michelle said, I'm positing the problems. I don't have to offer a solution to this, but just to give you a sense of what's happening in the Okanagan. And then just very briefly, because I know a lot of people also deal with the classic wines of Europe. As Michelle said, I'm the European buyer. And we know, here's a picture of Bordeaux, classic green and lovely Bordeaux from the textbooks, but we know what's been happening there is steadily the harvest dates are getting earlier. More often than not, we're having to deal with high alcohols, high pH, drought in the summer in this maritime climate. And producers have been slowly adapting to this. And then you have a vintage like 2021, where all of a sudden we're looking at producers having to chaptalize, where they haven't for many years, right? Looking for that body, for that roundness. Most of the Merlot, especially on the left bank, was not usable, was not ripe. So again, it's this point of being agile. It's not just about a steady warming of the climate. It's about dealing with whatever that season is going to throw at you. So your toolkit has to be very, very large. And that brings me to my last point. So something that is becoming more and more mainstream. I work for a 198 store chain, and natural wine is no longer just in the on-trade. We're getting more and more people asking about it. The demand is higher. We're having more and more, let's say, mainstream or larger producers that are attempting to make it. But in the context of climate change, with rising pHs, rising alcohol levels, etc., making wines inherently less stable, how does this work together? And again, as a retailer, and I bet that Junior would agree with me, we don't really have the leeway that a restaurant would have. If we're going to put a natural wine on the shelf, it has to be stable. We don't have the sommelier or the server there to explain, some minor faults in the wine that people might find interesting. To me as a retailer, the faults are not interesting. The wine has to be clean, and we know that there are examples of it, but how does that work together? So how do we manage all of these effects, but still make a wine that is natural? And of course, this is not a seminar on natural wine, but I think you have to address it, because this is what, especially the younger generations, I have my nieces and nephews, my young customers that are in their early 20s, they're really, really conscious about the wines they buy. And they're not only asking what happens in the vineyard, they're asking about, how did you treat your employees in the vineyard and the winery? What actually went into the wine? So this is something that we have to really manage and discuss. And how does this affect our definition of natural wine as we go forward? So that seems like an easy question to pose to the panel, to pose for those listening. And I can't wait to hear what some of the ideas are.
Barb, that's such a beautiful segue to the next topic. Thank you so much. I just want to make a couple of points before we move on. You have such a, you mentioned a lot of great things. One of them is the price rising. We have to understand that these people are really, they're struggling. Just want to give an example. There's a producer in British Columbia, one of the most regarded producer, called Blue Mountain. They said, I think they sent a note about a month ago that they were not going to be able to bottle a single wine from last year because everything was affected by smoke taint. So that gives you an example of the challenges. And it's now pretty much every year there's a challenge with smoke taint and fires. And, with that, and Pepe will talk about the solutions, but before we go to the solutions specifically, I think we always have to remind ourselves how we need to collaborate together as the wine industry. There's another producer in British Columbia called David Patterson, who makes wine at Tantalus, one of the highly regarded, producers. He was saying people in the regions were kind of shy to share what they were doing, embarrassed to say they had smoke taint when everyone had it. And so he was calling his friends in Oregon, in Australia, who had been dealing with smoke taint to find out solutions. So I think we're all in this together. And what a region is facing today, it might be you tomorrow. So I think, that collaboration. And the other point, Barb, that you were making is the price rising. I think in the whole global thing of climate change, I think we have to start being willing to maybe consume less and better. And that goes along with perhaps the price is rising. Maybe you won't drink as much, but what you'll drink, you'll support producers, because at the end of the day, behind that brand, there's humans making those wines and they need to make a living. So I just want to touch on those really important points that you mentioned. We are going to come back with you, Barb, at the end for a question with everyone. But I think this is a great segue to Pepe. Pepe, so we have lots of challenges, as I was mentioning in introduction, with climate change. We often think of the challenge, we think of the fire, we think of those images with frost, but we often don't really talk about the solution it means for winemakers in the winery. And I know Lallemand has done a lot of work to offer solutions to producers. So I'm really happy to have you with us to share some of those solutions.
Thank you, Michelle. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So first of all, Michelle, thanks a lot for your nice introduction. As you mentioned, I'm in Spain. I'm coming from Spain, but I love South America. I'm traveling every year to South America, and I have plenty of friends there. And thanks for lead us, to share this what we mentioned microbiological solutions for what and DUMONT and myself, we were exchanging about the title, and I like this wording of uncertain climate. Of course, we are talking about climate change, but as Barbara mentioned, we are really facing some uncertain climate year by year. So I will try to focus a little bit on the production side and on the winemaking side, and also to the sharing with you some of these possible solutions, natural solutions and biological solutions. So just to say a few words about the climate change and the consequences. Of course, nothing new for all of you. As Barbara mentioned, globally, if we simplify the consequences, we are talking about the influence on the wines, on the grapes, of course, dealing with higher alcohols, decreasing total acidity, and increasing the pH. This is one of the different studies done, in this case in the south of France. You can see the evolution on the total acidity and the ethanol content of the wines from 1980 to 2020 with analysis of 1,500 wines per year. So this is a clear observation worldwide in plenty of different regions. But I would say that one of the main consequences of the climate change is that the weather is not more predictable. As Barbara mentioned, if we focus on the last, no long time ago, but last 10 years, talking with the different winemakers, so it hails when it used not to hail. It rains when we have facing a lot of rains closer to harvest time. We are facing a spring frost, which is not usual in this region. Of course, we have the influence of the droughts, the influence of the floodings. So it's more and more difficult for the winemakers to predict and to organize the vintage, organize the quality of the grapes, and always focusing on the wine quality. So that means that looking for all the possible solutions for dealing with the consequences of the climate change is more and more important today, and of course the winemakers worldwide are really open to it. So of course I'm not going to enter into the details about the consequences of the high alcohol. Of course, from the fermentation point of view, we have an increased risk of fermentation stops. But from the market point of view, my colleagues could enter in more details more than myself. Also, what is important from the quality of the grapes, the low nitrogen in the grape mast, which has a direct influence on the fermentation behavior. And one of the main issues already commented by Barbara is the gap between the technological maturity or the sugar maturity or the aromatic maturity with the phenolic maturity, which is one of the main issues today. No? Of course, the result is most of the cases unbalanced wines with lack of acidity, heavy, dull wines with lack of freshness, tension, etc., etc. So the high pH, the consequence, of course, the consequence on the high pH, as we will see, is as higher the pH is, the higher risk of a possible deviation coming from microorganisms, undesirable microorganisms, mainly coming from the spontaneous or contamination. Okay, so at minimum we can decrease the quality of the wine, but in the worst scenario we could face the development of flavors that in all cases we will face a global decrease of the value of the wine. So we can, of course, from the microbiological point of view, we can act in different direction. We don't have the time today, but it's interesting for you to know that we are also developing and researching in some tools to apply in the vineyard, some yeast derivatives, applying by foliar spray, that the aim is to advance the secondary metabolism of the grapes, for sure to advance the phenolic and the aromatic maturity, with the goal to balance a little bit this gap, but it will need another big session, and we don't have enough time today for it. But just to let you know, and we will focus. We will be focusing mainly on the winemaking process in two ways. In one way, to looking for increase naturally the acidity of the wines, and also avoiding microbiological instabilities due to the high pH. So in the case of the management, in the management of the low alcohol and acidity management, of course, the yeast in the center of the fermentation has a big role on it. And during the last 20 years, we have been working on this topic. And one of the main topics is the dream of the wine industry, the dream of the winemakers, and also in collaboration with many research centers, that is the looking for low alcohol yield yeast. As you know, globally, to simplify, the yeast is converting the sugars of the grapes, mainly glucose and fructose, in ethanol and CO2, around 92%, but also in some other metabolites like glycerol, organic acids, and also some aromatic compounds. So it's interesting because when you look into the offer of wine selected yeast strains, we ran a project some years ago, starting around 100 selected yeast strains available for the winemakers. And as you can see there, in the different conditions for red winemaking, white winemaking, mimicking those conditions, the difference on the alcohol yield is really, really low. So it's below 0.3 alcohol at the end of the process. So dealing with this focus, we started a long-term project with the INRA in Montpellier, through an innovative process of selection of wine yeast, that the main goal was to divert the sugars into the production of glycerol. So in this way, if we produce higher glycerol, the aim was to reduce the final ethanol level, because we are reducing the yield of the yeast strain to produce alcohol. So surprisingly, thanks to this selection methodology, we found one strain that has this ability, but in parallel has the ability, surprisingly and luckily, to overproduce some organic acids. So because some of the metabolisms of this strain are correlated. Okay, so this strain has the ability also to overproduce some organic acid that has, of course, influence on the acidity. So after years of experiences dealing with wineries and winemakers worldwide, mainly in hot climate regions, mainly in red winemaking, we have faced an interesting impact of this strain, only fermenting the red grapes, in the increase of the total acidity, the decrease of the pH, thanks also to the high glycerol content. As you know, the glycerol has also an interesting impact on the mouthfeel. And in terms of alcohol content, we, on average, in learning more and more varieties, more fermentative conditions, we are dealing with a decrease of 0.5 on average of alcohol, which is not peanuts for plenty of for many of winemakers we are working with. So recently we received really good feedback from Rhone Valley with high sugar grenache, high alcohol grenache. Is the same with garnachas in Spain in some regions, that this strain is helping them also to balance these high alcohols, high pH, but also maintaining the typicity and the typicity and aromatic potential of those grapes. So in continuation with the yeast, of course, we mentioned there the biodiversity, because it's our main source of innovation. As you know, we are only dealing with microorganisms, dealing with live microorganisms, and then derivatives of these microorganisms. And you know, the biodiversity is still offering us really nice surprises, really nice tools. And from years we are looking not only for Saccharomyces, which is the main responsible of the alcoholic fermentation, but also for other species that are more common in the grapes or in the must. So one of these species is named Lallemand thermotolerans, and we have the chance to select one of the strains belonging to this species, La Rioja. And it's interesting in relation to this topic, because this strain has the ability to consume sugars producing lactic acid. So in dealing with this strain during the fermentation, because the idea is to inoculate this strain at the beginning of the process, leaving this strain fermenting from 1 to 3, 4 days, and then inoculate with Saccharomyces to finish the fermentation, because these species are more sensitive to alcohol. It's a really interesting tool from many different aspects, because we are consuming sugars and we are increasing the natural acidity of the wines. So after several years of experiences, both in this case in whites, rosé and red wines, it's really interesting because in collaboration with the knowledge of plenty of winemakers worldwide, some of them are using this Lactia, this Lallemand, for some of their varieties, mainly the high pH varieties from the 3 colors, to balance and to have a hint of acidity, of freshness. And in other cases, some winemakers are, for instance, fermenting some vats, some tanks of the wineries, leaving the Lallemand producing more and more lactic, and they have a reservoir or reserve of acidity to blend at the end of the fermentation with some other wines. So it's a nice interesting tool. And also from the organoleptic point of view, this is an example of Merlot for south of France, and you can see here the impact on of course, in the acidity and freshness. But in this case, it's interesting because the lactic acid produced by this Lallemand, the perception is more in relation with citric sourness. So it's really fresh and citric impact. No? So again, from a biological point of view, from a biological control of the fermentation, we can balance the lack of acidity of some of the grapes due to the climate change. Then I remember in the first session that my colleague Anne Dumont made some teasing about malolactic fermentation, because of course we are both fans of this process, of this malolactic fermentation, and dealing with the malolactic fermentation, to simplify, is mainly the conversion of the malic acid, which is a greener or harsher acid, into the lactic acid. It's a kind of biological, in this case, deacidification. But of course, it's a simplification because there are plenty of other implications, mainly from the organoleptic point of view, from the good side and also from the bad side, in the case of uncontrolled malolactic fermentation. And of course, it brings a microbial stability. So in this case, we are facing the acidity in terms of we are facing an increase of the pH from 0.1 from 0.3 to 0.3, sorry, after the malolactic fermentation. So in the frame of the high pH wines, it's interesting because, as you know, the malolactic fermentation is mainly run by a species which is Inoculation oenology. But we can find in nature some strains of Lactobacillus plantarum that has also some abilities to go through the malolactic fermentation. So in this case, this strain that we had the ability to select in Italy some years ago, it is really interesting because thanks to metabolism, it's not able to produce volatile acidity, acetic acid from the sugar. And also, when we inoculate this strain at the beginning of the process, the malolactic fermentation is done really, really fast. So that means that for the ones in the audience that are dealing with the winemaking process, that means that you are finishing the alcoholic fermentation with the malolactic fermentation ready. So imagine which is the big advantage of this natural tool to control the possible deviation of these high pH wines, because, for instance, in some regions of the world, I can give you an example of Argentina, the Malbec, high pH, that sometimes they have the spontaneous malolactic fermentation during the alcoholic fermentation, which is an issue for them. And this type of microbiological tools, this type of selected bacteria, natural bacteria strain, it's also an interesting tool for many of different reasons. Again, plenty of examples, plenty of varieties, plenty of different regions, Australia, France, Spain, with the feedback of very fast malolactic fermentation during the alcoholic fermentation. Clean wines, that means really low volatile acidity at the end of the alcoholic fermentation. And in parallel, because this strain is taking advantage quickly thanks to its enzymatic activity of the whole malic acid, it produces a higher amount of lactic acid, which has also an interesting impact on the sensory profile of the wines. So again, new microbes adapted to higher pH and useful for winemaking on these conditions. So if we continue on the history about the high pH of these possible conditions due to the climate change, of course, one of the other implication is the risk of spoilage, risk of improving of flavors coming from spoilage microorganisms. And it's funny because we are dealing with the climate change, we are dealing with higher pH, but also we are dealing with some wine trends in the industry. So that means that if we deal with the high pH wine and the aim of the industry more or less globally to reduce the level of SO2, which is one of the main tools of the winemakers in terms of antimicrobial and antioxidant capacity for using in the winery, it makes their life more and more complicated, because of course we are dealing with a situation that is more risky for the fermentation, for the stability of the wines, but also for many different reasons that we are not going to enter into the details. The global trend is try to reduce step by step the levels of SO2. So plenty of calls about it. So Pepe, my life is becoming really, really difficult because of all these situations. So please, do you have anything to help us or to rebalance a little bit my situation? So that's why we are working on this topic from many years ago, starting to do the climate change and also to help the winemakers into this situation to balance the reduction of SO2 from the whole process. And of course, if you are looking to an spontaneous or non-controlled fermentation, take in mind that at the beginning in the grapes you have a mix of different microbes coming from different yeasts, mainly non-Saccharomyces, mainly apiculated yeast, other species, different species of bacteria, Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, of course, acetic acid bacteria, that if we look into the low pH scenario, we are, I would say, better controlled, because in the lower pH, the resistance of some of these microorganisms is lower. So that means that below 3.5, the life in terms of controlling spoilage fermentation is a little bit easier. But once we move into the higher pH, the development of these undesirable, some of these undesirable microorganisms become, their life become more and more easier, and we are in a situation and in a higher risk situation in the case of a higher pH. Why? Because all these microorganisms involved are the responsible or the appearance of some of these of flavors of some compounds, like for instance, apiculate yeast, oxidative yeast, with their ability to increase the volatile acidity, the ethyl acetate, the ability of some bacteria to produce biogenic amines. As you know, these are compounds coming from bacteria, mainly from bacteria metabolisms that could have some health issue, mainly some allergenic reaction for some sensitive consumers, but also some organoleptic impacts. Of course, the volatile phenols coming from Brettanomyces, another big topic that the industry is working with since many years, and some unpleasant aromas, excess of diacetyl, mossy taint, which is interesting because it's coming back. This is a taint that appeared plenty years ago in Australia, but step by step it's coming back. And it's also interesting because it's like one of the taints that is starting to be studied, or some producers are being aware of it, mainly in the situation of this type of more extreme winemaking, like so for instance natural wines or wines with low SO2. So in global, that we are talking here, it's mainly that all these compounds are masking the fruit aromas, the typicity of the wines, and the quality of the potential quality of the wine coming from the quality of the grapes. So what is the natural way or a biological way to control contaminants? Of course, if the winemaker, like an orchestra director, he knows the different musicians that are doing their job in their wine, they can also control better the occupy the media, avoiding that other microorganisms could enter into the process during the fermentation or after fermentation. So, of course, since years, and my colleague Anne explained really well the history of the yeast selection, and when we started to offer the selected yeast to the winemaker, we started the bioprotection or biocontrol at this period many years ago. But recently, we are also looking for another type of species, as I told you, that could lead also to could help the winemakers to control the possible development of other undesirable yeast or other undesirable bacteria, mainly through the pre-fermentative stages. I'm not going to come back to the CO2, but this alternative method is interesting because the idea is to implant with a positive microflora to compete with the contaminant population. We are in collaboration with plenty of group of research and selecting different yeast, non-Saccharomyces yeast. And here is the example of one of them, which is called Mechnicovia fructicola, that we select in Burgundy in collaboration with the IFB in the region. And it's interesting because this is a non-Saccharomyces strain that had a good ability to multiply in the media. We are talking mainly in the pre-fermentative stages, and compete against this spoilage, possible spoilage microflora at the beginning of the process. So this is helping the winemaker in plenty of different axes. One of the main one is the reduce of SO2 addition, but of course reduce the possible constraint coming from this species. For one of the example is the inoculation of this strain during the cold soak. As you know, the cold soak is is a well-known practice worldwide. That means that put in contact the grape skins with the mast at low temperature at the beginning of the process without alcohol before fermentation to extract the anthocyanins and the aromatic precursors. But during this process, we could have some constraints, mainly due to these anseniosporas, these apiculated yeast, that could lead to an increase of acetic acid and ethyl acetate. So if we have the colonization of this well-known Mesnicovia of the media, we could also suppress the development of those other yeast. Coming back to the bacteria inoculation, it's interesting because most of you have in mind that the malolactic fermentation comes after the alcoholic fermentation as a natural process. First, we have the alcoholic fermentation and then the malolactic fermentation. But again, at the beginning of the 2000s, we started some research, some project with the idea of inoculate the bacteria at the beginning of the process. That means the co-inoculation, which is the inoculate the bacteria 24-48 hours after the yeast inoculation. So you can imagine at that period that all the winemakers was telling us, you are completely crazy, I'm not going to put a bacteria with sugar, it will be a disaster and so on. But step by step, in a soft way, studying, researching, we are now, we reached the goal that I tell you the co-inoculation is a common wording today in the wine industry worldwide, and it's a practice which is used in plenty of regions for many different reasons. And one of the reasons, of course, is the what we are talking about now, which is, of course, the control of the spoilage microbiota. Because coming back from one of these spoilage microorganisms, this ubiquitous yeast, the Brettanomyces, which is around in the ambient, sometimes from the beginning in the grapes, sometimes in the winery, sometimes in the barrels. So this is one of the examples that shows that the advance of the bacteria inoculation leads to a decrease of the timing before the end of the alcoholic fermentation and the onset of malolactic fermentation. Take in mind that during this process, where sometimes the winemaker decides to be a spectator. So I finish the alcoholic fermentation, I sit down and wait for the malolactic fermentation spontaneous. So this is one of the main issues, is that during this period, you have the wine without SO2, you have the wines with the winemakers tend to increase the temperature of the vats to run the malolactic fermentation. You have some residual sugars, you have some residual nutrients coming from yeast autolysis. So if you are unlucky that the Brettanomyces is around, is one of the main risky stages that Brettanomyces could enter into your wines. So advancing the bacteria inoculation, we are decreasing the risk of Brettanomyces because we are reducing the timing, but also in the case of inoculating bacteria at the end of the process, we are again colonizing the media and suppressing the growth of the possible bacteria, of the possible bread contamination. And again, this is also in relation with some other constraints that I have already mentioned, like the biogenic amines that are mainly related with some undesirable bacteria. So again, under a well-known natural selected bacteria running the malolactic fermentation, without the ability of producing biogenic amines, this is another interesting, valuable tool for the winemakers nowadays. So to conclude on this part, of course, from the biological point of view, by occupying the microbiological space, avoiding the growth of other species, shortening the malolactic fermentation, and also stabilizing the wines early, which is also a nice opportunity for the wineries. So, and last but not least, just to say some words about some other new biological and natural tools that the winemakers have today. And in this case, we are talking about the Chitosan. I'm sure, but for some of you, it's not familiar, but take in mind that is the polymer widely spread in the in the earth, I would say. Secondly, with the cellulose. And it's interesting because it's natural, it's non-allergenic, it's biodegradable, so it's really environmental friendly. So it was approved some years ago by the OIB, but the source in this way is natural source is coming from Aspergillus niger, which is the only source of Chitosan approved by the OIB and approved for the wine industry to apply during the fermentation and in wines. So as I mentioned, it comes from Aspergillus niger, from the chitin of Aspergillus niger through a process that leads to obtaining the Chitosan. So we have a deep knowledge on the application of this natural tool, because the study, for instance, on the impact on Brettanomyces. So it's interesting because this Chitosan has the ability to kill the Brettanomyces. Is mainly through an interaction with the cell membrane of Brettanomyces, with the disruption and the death of the cells, and also combining with an absorption phenomena. That means that after a treatment, we have a kill and aggregation phenomena that we can reduce drastically the population of Brettanomyces. So today, the winemakers, in the frame of high pH, but also in the frame of low SO2 winemaking, it's a really interesting natural tool to decrease the population of Brettanomyces in a preventive way, but also in a curative way. And we are dealing also with another derivatives from Chitosan that also has a big impact on the bacteria, lactic acid bacteria and acetic bacteria. So again, really an interesting natural tools from the different side to fight against some spoilage microorganisms to maintain the wine quality. So I hope I have seen more. I have done in a more or less clear way. I hope I won't be too much on these different tools, but just to conclude, in the microbiological, biological, and natural tool 6 to adapt the winemaking process and to help the winemakers worldwide to balance the impact of the climate change and also to maintain the quality and the purity of their wines in the market. So thanks a lot.
Gracias, Pepe. That was amazing. Really clear and concise. Thank you so much. We have a few questions for the panelists. I'm just going to ask them now, and then we'll move on to the last part of the webinar. One of the questions is for me. You're talking about the benefit of doing malolactic and how we can inoculate so that it's done earlier. And by doing malolactic, the wine is more stable. But we're seeing now some producers experimenting with red wine by stopping malolactic fermentation. So what is the outcome as a red wine producer if MLF makes the wine more stable and then you decide to stop MLF? What happens?
Yeah, thanks for the question, because in fact it's quite interesting, and I have had the opportunity to exchange with some winemakers. I remember, for instance, one case in Chile 2 years ago with a rosé from Grenache that, to keep the freshness of that acidity, their goal was to keep the malic acid high. Of course, it's an interesting option, but when we talk about the red winemaking, it's a matter of counterbalance the risk. Because as you can imagine, having residual malic acid in your red wine, you have to be quite precautious in terms of stabilize this wine before bottling, in terms of reducing the population of possible mainly bacteria, to avoid some possible malolactic fermentation in bottle that leads to a decrease of the quality, appearance of some CO2 and so on. So again, it's an interesting tool. As I mentioned before, for some aspect, we have also some biological tools to decrease the population. But again, my recommendation is if you want to keep the malic acid in your red wine, you have to be aware of the further nice stabilization through filtration and other techniques to avoid possible further issues on bottle. Okay. That's why when we talk about malolactic fermentation, we talk about stability, because we are reducing or removing the malic acid.
Thank you.
I can add to that a little bit, Pepe, because I think it is a risk in my view. So, and you mentioned one tool which I use successfully, which is Lactia. And I think it gives such incredible acidity. To be honest, too much acidity. But that for me was to be used as a component, in the blend. And to reach overall balance. So I can reach overall balance and have the stability and go to sleep in peace.
Yes.
Thank you. That's great. There are a few questions coming in. Is there still a view that co-inoculation isn't advisable if the ending pH of the wine will be above 3.5?
Yes, of course. I mean, the co-inoculation, we know all about co-inoculation today after years of experiences, practical experiences. And when you are, as I mentioned, when you are in a situation of lower pH, the situation is more well controlled. But thanks to the experience with a proper protocol, that in the protocol of winemaking, you don't need many different recommendation to take in mind, but with the proper couple of the yeast, because we have to use a selected yeast, a selected bacteria, take in mind some of the temperature of fermentation, some key factors which are not really difficult to manage. The co-inoculation in high pH is also really advisable. And as I mentioned before, with the Lactobacillus plantarum, with the ML prime, now the situation is pretty full under control, because you don't have any risk that this strain, by consuming sugar, could lead to the production of volatile acidity. Okay, so we have also different tools, Enococcus oeni, Lactobacillus plantarum, to deal with different type of wines.
We have one question about the plantarum. Someone is asking, I know the answer, but I'll let you answer. Why is it that the plantarum won't ferment the sugar in co-inoculation mode?
Yes, when we talk about ferment sugars, when we talk about the use of sugars globally, the bacteria use sugars to growth. Okay. So, for instance, some other species like Enococcus, some Pediococcus, some other species, when they use sugars to growth, they can produce some lactic acid, but also some acetic acid, and also during the malolactic fermentation. In this case, the metabolism of Lactobacillus plantarum, of this Lactobacillus plantarum, if they consume sugars, they are only able to produce lactic acid. So it's a specific metabolism of this strain. Okay. That's why when we talk about homofermentative, heterofermentative, I didn't want to enter into this wording, but it's mainly just to make it simple, okay?
Your explanations are amazing, because when you're trying to read in a book, understanding this, you make it so simple, easy to understand. So thank you. And there's another question: why should plantarum not be inoculated after alcoholic fermentation?
This is a great question. I guess it's a winemaker. I guess because this is a common question from winemakers. So it's really interesting, and also thanks to the knowledge we are having. Globally, we are recommending in co-inoculation for different factors, but one of the main factors is that the Lactobacillus plantarum, it's quite sensitive, for instance, to alcohol and mainly to polyphenols. Okay, so when we are in the red winemaking, the possibility to inoculate after alcoholic fermentation is there, but as you can imagine, when we propose one tool, one options, we want to propose in a way that is almost 99% in the recommendations we have feasible and practice for the winemaker. So what we propose when some winemakers wants to try after alcoholic fermentation, we run a quick test, because as I mentioned, the kinetics and the consumption of the malic acid is really quick. So we run a quick test to assure that in those conditions, the ML prime could work. So this is our advice today. But it's mainly due to the alcohol and polyphenols in the red wine making.
Thank you. One more question, and then we're going to go to Junior, and we'll come back for all of the other questions at the end. This is a big topic, and but I believe you'll be able to answer that in a very simple manner. Can you comment on the effect of MLF and other yeast cultures on the histamine that give you red wine headaches? Is there a culture that prevents these? It's a big topic.
It's a big topic. We can open a big debate after with Anne, which is, we are working on this topic for years, but recently Anne is dealing with the institute and we other actors in the wine industry about this topic. But yes, to make it simple, mainly the biogenic amines, they are coming from bacteria metabolisms of some species. Okay, so if we want to, in fact, if we want to control the development of the production of biogenic amines, one of the recommendations, which also I recommend you to look for the OIB, because for instance, the OIB has published a recommendation for lowering the biogenic amines, and one of the recommendations is the controlling of malolactic fermentation with natural selected wine bacteria. Because through the selection, one of the criteria we are having is to assure that I'm not talking about the metabolism again, but they are not able to produce or to descarboxylate the amino acid to produce biogenic amines. Okay, so that means in the scenario of alcoholic and malolactic fermentation, we could take in mind this option mainly, okay, to control the malolactic fermentation. But also, if we advance the inoculation of the bacteria, it has to be in combination with a selected yeast, because if not, if we don't know how is the yeast that year after year, that they can be different year after year, that are running the alcoholic fermentation, is a little bit risky to co-inoculate with a malolactic bacteria. Okay.
Oh, Anne has something to add to this.
This is one of my favorite topics. So if,
I know.
if you don't mind, I'm going to comment. This is very interesting, this topic of biogenic amine and histamine. And Sophie Parker-Thompson wrote her dissertation, MW dissertation on this topic. And she has shown that the resurgence or the popularity of low SO2 wine has shown an increase actually in the production of those biogenic amines, and of course the intolerance of people to those compounds. And it's quite, it was quite evident in our research. And some of the best tools, of course, is controlling the development of the microorganism, as Pepe explained it very well, controlling the development of those microorganisms that can produce biogenic amines. So it's an important topic, and a lot of people that produce wine, but also a lot of people that buy wines are concerned about that, because there are some people that have, of course, an intolerance reaction to those compounds. So keep that on your radar for those compounds. I think we're going to hear more about it, especially with the popularity of low SO2 wines. So.
And it's such a good point, because the thing is, people make, it's kind of ironic, because people often associate headaches to SO2, which in fact it's not to the SO2, but by putting lower SO2, then we're having more of the problem. So it's a complicated topic, and we need to talk more about that, I think, to consumer. So I just want to continue here, and we'll come back with everyone on the screen, because I do have a few more questions for Barbara and for Junior. But Junior, today you'll be talking about, Barbara has talked about the BC perspective. You are going to talk about your perspective in the UK market, and also your experience with some of the tools that Pepe has talked about. So all yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Pep. You such great presentations. You make my life a little bit harder, but I'm going to give a brief overview of the subject. And I know there's some MW students, so it's going to be global because I think Barbara already talked about Canada. And I am very lucky with what Pepe talked about. I've tasted some trials. I have used myself with some customers in different parts of the world. So I have some practical examples to share. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I think Barbara mentioned the extreme climates of Canada, and for every single example that she has, I can pick any part of the world and match, and even better in some cases, because you're talking about fire. But if you look at in Australia, the bushfires that they had in 2019 and 2020, it burned 11 million hectares. It's incredible. It's almost the size of North Korea. You're talking about frost. If you look at frost, what happened in France in 2021, it caused over 2 billion euros of loss. So there are a lot of global, I'm not going to go into that more, but there are a lot of really extreme climate examples. But some incidents are not quite so extremes. But they are, and this is why Pepe's presentation is very important, because they are not such extreme climate incidents, but they are equally lethal, especially for quality. And one of them that we didn't talk about is heat spikes. And if you look at California, for example, in 1980s, there was on average 13 days where the temperature raised over 30 degrees Celsius. And in 2040, it's forecasted that there will be more than 65 days. So that's a huge amount of stress in the vine, and everything that we talked about, high sugar level, high pH. It's going to be even worse than it is now. This is why microbiological tools are important now, and they're going to be very, very important into the future. But one thing that Barbara probably she's experienced in terms of how buying, and I have been buying for many, many, many years wine. And when I was less experienced, I would line up a wine. And this is a good tip for a buyer and also for a producer. I would line up some wines and I say, okay, I found the wine that I like, and that will be a decision. And I think Barbara mentioned it very wisely. When you're looking for a supplier, you're looking for a long-term supplier. It's vitally important. And with experience, I decided, you know what, I don't select one more supplier. I would pre-select 3 or 4, and then I would go and visit them. And I would ask technical questions. And I would challenge the research and development. And I would look what they're doing, what are they planting? Are they aware of those microbiological tools? Because if they are, for me, I knew I would be in very good hands. And if I remember visiting, Barbara puts a beautiful picture of Bordeaux. If you go and speak to the guys at the right at the top, they will be aware of what's going on. So if your supplier is not aware, you know, in the future they will have huge challenges, and if you are working with them, you'll be left behind. So that's, as a buyer, it's vitally important that my suppliers were aware of those tools. And so if you're a producer, what would you do now? You be, at least you should be well informed. So it's great to see some wine producers here, because at minimum you should know what is happening. And I'm going to offer you some of the solutions, long-term, short-term, medium-term, and short-term. But one of them, let's talk about long-term. What can you do to overcome such climatic changes? One of them is just to look into new varieties. But we are talking about long-term, because, you know, we're talking 5 or 10 years. This is already start to happen in Bordeaux with planting Tempranillo, planting Touriga Nacional, planting some old varieties like Castex and Lillorilla, things like that. Another thing is looking at different clonal selection. In Pepe is in Spain. If you're looking at Spain, you look at Tempranillo, there's so many different types of clones, over 250 clones. For example, clone 54 is a clone that retains better acidity. And the other solution is obviously looking for a new terroir. There are many examples around the world. I don't have to mention so many, but one of them is in Bordeaux, for example, in Burgundy, for example, people are looking at haute côte, which is slightly cooler, used to be cooler, now is in the future is going to be making better wines for certain. In terms of medium term, one of the things that you can do is adaptive viticulture, looking for to protect your fruit, just using shade. And then here we start talking about the use of microbiology, which is the main part of this conversation. And Pepe already talked about using different types of yeast. You saw in one of the Pepe's slides a yeast called Ionis. He mentioned what the yeast does in terms of decreasing the alcohol level, improving acidity. One thing I don't think Pepe mentioned, in my experience, it also increased the level of succinic acid. I don't know if I'm right. And that's, I remember, I tasted a set of samples together with over 100 producers from Argentina. And this was a set of wines that were made in Mendoza by the research center or a local research center. And they had a natural fermentation. They have a fermentation with a yeast that's appropriate for Malbec, and they have the yeast that Pepe just mentioned called Ionis. And the vast majority of producers present, we've tasted blind, everyone preferred Ionis because it was fresher, it was tighter, but had the lovely savory notes. And that's what Pepe said, it was more scientific. What I'm telling you is actually what I felt and what producers felt. So that is a great tool that can be used to add complexity to the wines. And I think with Pepe and Anne start talking about biogenic amines, that is a topic for a complete new masterclass. And so is the malolactic, because one of the things I have learned more in recent years, last 2-3 years, is amazing what can be done in terms of malolactic fermentation, co-inoculation, different types of bacteria. I remember I've used one last year called VP41, which I was just looking for less levels of diacetyl, and really helps to tighten up the wine. So this is just one of the examples that I can give now, but honestly, this is a topic, it's so rich, this topic, we can do a whole hour and a half on malolactic. And looking back at the short term, I don't think there is any short-term solution here. There is no one magic bullet point. One of the things, I think, is a combination of facts. You can use stalks, that will help you reduce the level of alcohol by a little bit. You can fill up your tank all the way up, that helps a little bit. And you can pick a little bit early. You can adopt technologies such as spinning cones or reverse osmosis and all that. Or you can use microbiology. And again, Pepe gave some ideas. I think I mentioned earlier on Lactia. I use it successfully. I'm going to carry on using it. It's been excellent. But one of the things that if I was a producer, if any producers watching this, don't wait. Because if you look at Bordeaux, for example, they start to looking at researching new varieties, planting new varieties. They start to panic after 2003 vintage, when it was so hot. And we know things are warming up. If you look at what Torres has been measuring, he's been monitoring the temperatures for the last 50 years. And the average increase has been 1.2 degrees Celsius. The harvest time and during that time has been shortened by 10 days. So we know it's increasing. So don't wait. That's my opinion. Start looking for things. Start researching now. Yeah, that's all I can say. And I can go offer some more examples in a minute. And then Barbara mentioned the natural wine scenario, and the whole thing. It's the title of my first slide was Microbiological Solutions for Modern Winemaking Challenge. And I think natural wine philosophy for me it's a challenge. I buy wines to give pleasure to consumers. The wines have to be good. They have to they're there to be enjoyed. When I drink a glass, I want to be transported to the region. If I'm paying good money, if I'm drinking a glass of Chianti, I want to be transported. I want this sense of place. I don't want the wine to have any faults, any deviation. So this is quite important. I think often the professionals, they have, I'm talking about many professionals, I'm not going to name, but many professionals, without attacking anyone, some sommeliers, some journalists, but even myself in the past, I have to admit, you have a lack of knowledge. But I think professionals have a very limited knowledge of microbiology, and they express their views based on opinions, as opposed to facts, as opposed to science, and as opposed to very tangible evidence that we are seeing today. And I don't like when, and it's written on the slide, I don't like when the people use the philosophy as a marketing tool. If you look at the top producers who use biodynamic or use, they don't use that as a marketing tool. If they make good wine, they make good wine. I think the important thing, as I said, is for the wine to give pleasure. Finally, I think that I agree with Barbara, there is a trend towards local, there is a trend towards healthy and sustainable, but the goals of using microbiology should not be mutually exclusive. So I think there is, as Barbara said, somewhere we can meet. All we want is to make good wines and to give pleasures to consumers and to have a business that is sustainable.
Thank you. Very inspiring. I'd like to, now that we have everyone, I'd like to start straight with a question for both Barb and Junior. It's interesting, you're speaking about the philosophy of natural wine marketing, what you do as a buyer when you're buying wine from large, which isn't really interesting because and I have the same philosophy that you do, but I live in a place in Quebec where the natural wine movement is like really present. You go to pretty much any wine bar, that's what you find. But not only that, in the monopoly. A few weeks ago, the SAQ just had a big release of natural wine. So there's a room when you go to the SAQ, natural wine, and also they do a huge release that people wait to buy the wine they want online, right? So it's not just the small sommelier, the small restaurants with the sommelier selling this wine. This is now a reality of the monopoly pushing those wines to consumer. So my question for you is, how do we educate consumers? Because a lot of people don't have that knowledge, and they, unfortunately, they've become to associate some of those faults. The consumer go and say, I like that funky wine because they think it's interesting. They don't really, to me, it's just another form of, in the past, people would hang on to oak because it was sticking out in the wine. Now it's something else sticking out, but it's a fault. So it's something that feels them comfortable. They identifying something that they think it's supposed to be good. How do we change? How do we re-educate consumers?
Barbara, do you want to go first?
I'll go first. Happy to, and it's a big question. And I think, Michelle, it's not about educating consumers. I think, you know, those of us on the call, we've devoted our lives to understanding wine, and we've gone into our different paths that we understand very well, but customers don't have that time. They have other lives. They just want an enjoyable glass of wine. And I think we have to accept that if there are consumers that don't mind volatile acidity, raging Brettanomyces, a second fermentation, you know, oxidation in their Sancerre, I think we just have to let them work through that. I think we have to be gentle. And I think those of us who are in buying positions, more and more, it's our responsibility to acknowledge that this movement exists, that I don't think it's going anywhere, that it really is fueled by these new young drinkers that are coming to it. But I think on a positive note, more and more, I'm able to try so-called natural wines. This is a term we've used several times now without actually having defined it, even in the seminar, you know, but generally, you know, low to no intervention wines, if such things exist. This is becoming mainstream, and the wines are getting better. As we know, most fine wines in the world are made with very little intervention to begin with. And I think it's possible, those of us who are gently educating, who are buying, who are teaching classes, we show examples of so-called natural wines that do have a sense of place, that are clean, because luckily they exist and they're getting more and more. And I think also Junior made a good point. Savoir-faire and use of microbiology and knowledge of winemaking is not mutually exclusive to natural wines. In fact, they can be really complementary. And I think we have to look forward. You know, I mean, Pepe's talking about using microbes, natural microbes, into the wine to combat spoilage yeasts. But I mean, this is something, the idea of biological, I was going to say warfare, but I don't mean, but biological solutions in the vineyard, natural predators, etc. This is one of the hallmarks of organic and biodynamic viticulture. So why haven't we considered that introducing a natural predator, a biological solution in winemaking, why would all of a sudden, why is that considered unnatural?
I love it. And Barb and I had a big debate about this recently when she was visiting Montreal, you know, and I think it's such a valid point. Really, really, really good. Anything to add to that, Junior, before I go on to Pepe for question?
No, I agree with everything that Barbara said. Look, we tasted. I'm telling you, I put my hand up. I tasted Bordeaux from the 80s. I thought, this is Bordeaux. This is amazing. This is, now we all know, looking back, is absolutely full of Brett. And so it's something that part of it is going to work itself out, and people will look back and say, "Ah, I was actually drinking." I'm not going to say a bad word, but I was actually drinking a faulty wine, to not to be rude. So it will work itself out. But I think also we, in this position as masters of wines, as journalists and who write, will have a duty at least to educate the opinion formers. So as we do our part, and hopefully we can get some way along to make people realize quicker that they're actually drinking a faulty wine. And also the third thing is actually hoping that the two worlds meet somewhere, because as Pepe said, I actually wrote down the words that he said. I'm talking about biological and natural tools, so they're not too far away. But there are some people in at least in one side of the argument, some, not all, they are really radical, and that's a problem. It's a problem in every situation, but even in wine. But I think those three things is let it work itself out. Let's educate opinion formers, and then let's hopefully somewhere along the line this reconciles. In a few years' time, we won't have this conversation anymore. Hopefully.
Thank you. And to end, I have one last question because I'm conscious of the time for Pepe. We talked briefly in the opening with the growing problem for some of the regions about smoke taint, but I know there are some tools out there that can help producers to deal with smoke taint. Can you talk about that?
Yes, it's also really interesting, as Barbara Junior mentioned, you know, that we are unfortunately we are dealing more and more with this issue. And I have to tell you that from the research point of view, it's also a big topic, because this has been studied for a long time. It started in Australia 20 years ago, and there are still some debates about it. So to make it simple, you know, when you have the compounds coming from smoke, they can enter into the grapes, and they are combined with sugars. So it's like these compounds, when they are combined with sugars, are not really perceivable or odorant. It's then through the fermentation process or afterwards, when you can feel it, you can feel this type of compounds are mainly volatile phenols. No? So of course there are some winemaking recommendations in terms of some of them are in relation with some of the topics we have been talking about, but of course you have to balance the contact of the skins with the mast, with a reliable fermentation, and also you try to, if you want to advance a little bit the break of these compounds, there are some other tools like enzymes, natural enzymes that can break these compounds which are linked with sugars. And then there are also some yeast derivatives, like the external part of the yeast. As you can see, we are taking advantage of the whole stuff of the whole yeast from many different aspects. But the external part of the yeast, which is the cell wall, has really a big absorption capacity. So once these compounds are released, the use of these cell walls from the yeast are able to remove a certain percentage of the perception of these compounds. But it's still a big challenge on the wine industry, because as some of the colleagues already talk about, when you have those compounds in the wine, it's not as easy to remove them. Okay.
Yeah, now I'll just add quickly. Yeah, to my experience, the same as Pepe, they become odoriferous during fermentation and also during aging. And I think Pepe mentioned occupying the microbial space. But the thing is, speed is vital. You have to do everything quickly, quick MLF, quick stabilizing. So the quicker you remove everything, the quicker you do it, the better.
Thank you. I foresee many more of those because there's so many more topics to discuss that we haven't been able to go. But I first want to thank Anne Dumont for really making this possible. We had two amazing, so informative seminars about a part of the wine that we don't talk enough about, that we don't understand enough. And I think we're really quick to go to some myth around a lot of things and make some quick conclusions about some of those topics. And I think we've seen last seminar and today that, you know, there are a lot of solutions that we should learn about. So I really want to thank you for that. And I want to thank my three amazing panelists today for your knowledge. Barbara Philippe, Pepe, Jose, and Junior, thank you so much. And I would like to end on something that, you know, you all shared. And, you know, we talked about education, and Junior said, don't wait. And I will say that, you know, your challenge today might have been the challenge of someone yesterday. The wine industry is very fragmented, and we're all busy doing what we're doing in our field. And there's so much knowledge out there that I encourage all of you today, when you leave, to share one of those solutions or those topics with people you know, because it's really by sharing those that we will move forward. The news are very strong at sharing what is dramatic. We really address the challenge, and I think we need to talk about the challenges. But the only way we're going to have a wine for tomorrow, the way we want the industry to be, is by focusing on the solutions. And a lot of those solutions already exist. So thank you so much, everyone. And for those of you who are interested, we have our next seminar on May 26th, and we'll be focusing on Spain. Spain has a lot of interesting solution to share from indigenous grapes. Yes, Pepe, we're going to talk about HERAS, how HERAS is known for fortified wine, but is now a trend in making some non-fortified wine with the rise of climate change. So lots of really interesting topic that we are going to be tackling. It's free. You can go to tastingclimatechange.com and you can register. And just a reminder that if you missed part 1, if you go to tastingclimatechange.com, you can watch the webinar from part 1 and the one from today as well. If you need to review some of those topics for some of those MW students, those seminars will be very helpful for your exam in July. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.